Good morning, everyone. Sorry for the slight delay this morning. Welcome to the Teachers Retirement System of the City of New York Investment Meeting for February 1st, 2018, and welcome to the month of February. Let's hope it's better than the month of January.
Warmer?
Yes. Let's start with calling the roll.
John Adler?
I am here.
Thomas Brown?
Here.
David Kazansky?
Present.
Deborah Penny?
Here.
Raymond Orlando?
Here.
Susanna Vickers?
John Dorsett at the Controller's Office.
We're good to go.
We have a quorum.
Thank you so much. Okay, turn it over to our friends from Rocketown to do our performance reviews.
Great. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, Mike.
And I think we're off to a good start given that there's no snow, at least in today's forecast. That might change tonight, I heard. So maybe we'll begin by reviewing the 2017 performance for the variable funds. And I apologize that once you go past the first page, the printing is a little shrunken on each page. So I'm happy to refer to any numbers if you have questions, but I'll focus my comments on page 1. Last year, the Diversified Equity Fund ended the year with about $15.8 billion in assets. The calendar year return for 2017 was 21.1%, roughly in line with that of the Russell 3000 index, so the broad measure of U.S. equity markets. The fund itself, while in line with the Russell 3000, lagged somewhat the hybrid benchmark, which you'll recall represents the passively invested targets of the Diversified Equity Fund. And when we look down and drill into those numbers a little bit, in a market that's been up over 20%, both the U.S. and abroad, last year the defensive composite was a bit of a drag in performance in absolute terms. So the defensive composite as a whole, you'll see, was up about 13.8%. Again, we don't always expect this composite to keep up with quickly rising equity markets, and that was certainly the case last year. So we saw some lagging with regard to that composite relative to the broad equity markets. What we also saw last year was a notable positive contribution from the non-U.S. allocation within the fund relative to the U.S. So non-U.S. markets and how they were invested in this fund, that composite was up about 27.3%. That was also the product of some relatively strong active management in that composite. So I wanted to note that. And then with regard to the actively managed U.S. composite, some negative tracking due to active management to the tune of about 130 basis points there. So net, when you compare the Diversified Equity Fund to the Russell 3000 benchmark, the fund did match the return of that benchmark. Some of the drawbacks in active management were offset by the non-U.S. allocation, and that you can see show up in the hybrid benchmark numbers. So before I jump to the other funds, I'll pause there and see if there's any questions.
Any questions for Mike? Nope. Okay,
so the other options, we'll round those out, and this is the last time I'll be referring to the performance of the bond fund. The bond fund ended the year with about $387 million in assets. The return for last year was 1.23%, roughly in line with its 1 to 5 year Gov credit benchmark. And then at the very end of last year, this fund transitioned beginning 1/1 to the balanced fund. So going forward, we'll be reporting on that. The International Equity Fund ended last year with about $149 million in assets. I mentioned before the strength of non-U.S. assets relative to the U.S., and you can see that in the returns here. That fund was up about 26.8%. Again, a little bit ahead of its benchmark, the International Composite Benchmark, which includes developed and emerging markets. The Inflation Protection Fund up about 59%. There you can see, I'm sorry. Let me clarify.
Wow. Great work, everybody.
Inflation has not been that high for quite some time. The Inflation Protection Fund had assets of about $59 million. The fund last year was up just over 4%, which was enough to outpace inflation by a couple percent. The socially responsive equity fund with assets of about $184 million. That fund was up about 18.3%, lagging the S&P, which was up about 21.8%. So I will pause there. Happy to dig into these numbers a little bit, and at the next meeting, we will close out the year's performance with a quick review again of these numbers as part of the quarterly update.
Any questions? I just have one question,
Sure.
which I think I know the answer to. So in the diversified, in variable A, we have international, which is, you know, a not insubstantial amount of money, right? It's $3 billion. And then we have a separate international equity fund, which is just $150 million. Are those funds managed by the same managers?
They are. So the portion of those funds that's invested is the same. I say it that way because there's an additional cash allocation within the international equity fund to help manage the cash flows from one option to the other.
The international equity fund, meaning this, the separate, it's what, variable C?
That's right. So there's an additional allocation to cash just to help manage liquidity from within the passport funds. And then if you're comparing performance between those, you'll note that the total performance for the passport funds, each of them on their own, includes the additional impact of administrative expenses, which is not included for the composite line item of the international equity composite within the diversified equity.
So let me just throw out something, which I'm sure is, you know, not practical. But $150 million out of, you know, whatever we have, 16 point something in the variable fund. That's 16 point something billion, right, in the variable fund. And the members are kind of, what's that?
No.
The members are kind of voting with their feet with regard to the international fund, and they get a substantial amount of international exposure by being in variable A. Does it make sense to have a separate variable C fund? There, I've said it.
I want to say I planted the question.
What did the question?
I want to say that I planted the question with you before the meeting, but it's funny you bring that up because one of the items on the work plan, which we'll also discuss in today's public agenda, is a review of the options that participants are offered. And we'll take the hope is we could take a little bit of a deeper dive to see, you know, what's behind the data. So, you know, which participants are allocating to some of the newer options versus who's still in the big diversified equity fund. Look a little bit about how participants are using the options, maybe even compare the offerings here to other systems offerings, and do a little bit of that work to kind of review the offerings, make any possible decisions about what changes might be warranted. Is there a need to add new options down the road? Is that something that the board would want to consider? That has not been done since variable C, D, and E were added back in 2008. But these are all questions that, and your question, I think importantly, is something we would take up as part of a broader review of the passport funds, which we've proposed maybe coming back to the board in September with.
Okay, thank you.
And I think your comments are also, you know, you could say that the Inflation Protection Fund and the Socially Responsive Equity Fund, those options haven't, I think, garnered the assets that maybe we were expecting when they were launched. But you could argue certainly that those options play a more unique role within the lineup.
Right. I mean, yes, they don't have very much. They don't have very many assets in them, and yet they do fulfill something that you can't get through variable A.
Absolutely.
So there may be more of a reason to keep them in the lineup. And it strikes me that there may be for keeping the international fund.
Yeah.
But I agree. Let's do it as part of a comprehensive review. I think that's a terrific answer.
Okay.
So, thank you. Any other questions regarding the performance review through year-end 2017? Okay. And let's just note for the record that Ms. Vickers has arrived. Thank you. Okay, so you want to then?
Yeah, I'll give a quick update on markets so far year to date, and I'll say year to date is actually just through Tuesday. But the comment I'll make about yesterday was just that roughly markets were up across the board here, and then we've seen the front end of the yield curve sell off a little bit. With regard to equity markets, though, through Tuesday, you can see the U.S. market here was up about 5.3%. The non-U.S. markets and the developed arena was also up about 5.3%, and emerging markets up about 4.1%. So with regard to equities, again, we've continued to see a pretty notable run, and I think through yesterday, we'd probably add another 0.5% to 1%, depending on the market you're looking at. So if you're trying to gauge that, that's where we are. If you're thinking about fiscal year to date through Tuesday, still very strong double-digit returns, ranging anywhere from about 15 to 20%. So again, very strong market environment. When we look further and take a peek at the performance for the underlying components of the Inflation Protection Fund, that you can see had a modestly negative return during January. And the underlying strategy for the Social Responsive Equity Fund up about 5.8%, just ahead of the S&P. So we'll be reporting on the final numbers for each of the passport options at the next meeting. But this is in the neighborhood of what we would expect.
So you anticipate that this performance will continue? We're looking at like 60% annual return.
Yeah, we might as well
Personally
extrapolate.
guaranteeing it.
No, it's remarkable. We were talking earlier. The 22 out of the last 23 months for the S&P have been positive.
That's right. Yeah, and last year was the only calendar year in 150 calendar years of data where the S&P was up every month. So let that sink in for a little bit.
Let's do some attribution analysis now. Okay.
Great.
Thank you. So now you're going to move on to the work plan?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've outlined a few work items here, and I don't think this is intended to be an exhaustive list of the projects that are going on, or things that we're planning to take up, and certainly it's meant to be open for the feedback of the board, and to the extent you'd like to help us further prioritize these items, please share that feedback. The ongoing discussions with regard to the investment policy, I think today later in the agenda, there was a discussion of the divestment policy, which is an important component of the investment policy overall. So we'll continue to make progress on that. The hope was that we make some progress and bring that back to the board at the March meeting. I don't want to make any promises, but we'll discuss that further. We've been doing some work with regard to the current country screens for investing across TRS abroad in emerging markets. We're planning to come back to the board with an update on that process in April. We thought it would be helpful this year to do a more in-depth fee review. We've made a lot of progress over the years in driving down the investment expenses, but we think from time to time makes sense to sort of take stock and inventory of where we are, where we think we can do better. But I think you've been very successful at doing that. Nonetheless, we'd like to present a review to the board on that topic. We've talked about within the passport funds, drilling into the international composite, John, that you mentioned earlier, looking at the composition of active and passive and identifying where there might be potential need for active managers. Is there a reason to change any of the managers? Doing a little bit of a deep dive there and bringing a recommendation back to the board with regard to that. I mentioned earlier a broader review of passport fund offerings. That's a project that needs, I think, quite a bit in terms of work going on in the background. So we'll ramp that up and bring that to the board. We're targeting roughly September. And then finally, what we've been talking about for on and off over the last couple years, And as we continue to identify compelling active managers, we'll bring those forward to the board for the U.S. equity composite. At this time, there's none, but we're constantly, and TRS is constantly meeting with managers that we consider for potential roles in the plan. And given the change to the active composite mandate to be up to 15%, we've said we don't want to always be there if we don't have opportunities that we think are compelling, but when we find them, we will bring those to you. So that's more of an ongoing process. And I will pause there and see if there's any feedback on these items or other items that you'd like us to focus on.
Questions or comments for?
John, I just have
Yes.
a process question. With some of these things that I think probably are for the TDA as well as the QPP, like the country screen, I was just wondering what the process is, because I know that, you know, BAM has been thinking a lot about this too, and how do we sort of work together to come to a good policy before kind of maybe coming forward?
Yeah, I think we just need to make sure that we're having conversations as we progress on the individual items well in advance of whenever we're planning to come back. So.
Well, just like I think we're doing pretty well in the IPS working together, just, you know, feel free to include me or John or reach out to us for conversations with investment staff.
Great.
Thanks.
We'll do.
Any other questions or comments for Michael on the work plan? Okay, thank you. Okay, next item on the agenda is the divestment policy. So I'll note that last week, or maybe early this week, we got the draft from, so this is the same draft that we got in December, right? And then we got a redline version from BAM yesterday. Or BAM's redline version, we got it.
Right, and you got the policy that BAM drafted last year as well. I handed that out at an investment meeting, and this is just taking some of those items that are a little bit different or in different places than the TRS draft and just synthesizing it together into one version.
So honestly, I really didn't have a chance to review the redline version since we just got it yesterday. I don't know if other folks are prepared to discuss it or comment on it today.
No, I think we'd like to wait as well, right?
Yeah.
To look it over together and.
Yeah, there seem to be some changes that are merely formatting and pleasing to the eye, let's say, but others that are more substantial. So I think we should.
Can we table it and add it to the agenda next month?
I think that makes perfect sense.
I agree.
Okay, so we'll do that. Put it on the agenda for the next investment meeting. The revision, I mean the whole policy, but especially the revisions from BAM. Okay. Okay, next we have the fossil fuel divestment resolution, which was originally introduced at the SIM, and now there's a somewhat amended version that folks got and that are just in our packet. So so that's I mean, I think formally what has to happen is there has to be but let's have a discussion and then we'll figure out a process. So any discussion on the resolution that's in front of us? Any comments? Okay, so I think formally what would have to happen is the maker of the motion, which I think is the controller, would have to, yeah, definitely the controller because he did it in public session at the SIM, would have to accept the revised version as a friendly amendment. So to the controller, do you accept the revised version as a friendly amendment?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Great. So, and I wasn't at the caucus. Was the resolution it was made, was it seconded at the caucus, at the SIM caucus?
It was.
Okay, great. So we have a motion made and seconded. We now have an amended version accepted by the maker of the motion. I don't think we need another second, right? Okay. And then, question, Valerie, can we just make sure there's consensus on this and we're good to go?
The consensus, and then these do typically go back
To the board meeting,
Before
but
we
that
have
would
the official
move it forward. Right.
Yes.
Okay. So, do we have consensus to accept the amended resolution made by the controller to approve this study, divestment study?
We do.
Okay, great. Okay, so then we'll put it on the agenda for formal adoption. I guess it goes in the executive director report, right?
Yes.
For the board meeting later this month. Okay, great. And then the last item for the public agenda is the Mercer report and next steps. So I think this is an open discussion. My Mercer report. So anybody want to kick off? And I'd open this up to staff as well as trustees for what we would do as next steps with regard to the Mercer report.
Well, I think
Yes,
you,
Ms. Kent.
I think you queued it up just as perfectly. Like, we have this Mercer report. Let's have a discussion of what the next steps are.
Thoughts? Mr. Kazansky?
Just moments ago, right, we decided on divestment as a move forward. And so I think what makes sense is while that process is playing out, that we take some of the actionable items that are reasonable, doable in the Mercer report and start figuring out how we're going to move forward on that.
I think that's a great idea, and I would just say from BAM's perspective, I think it's nice that TRS and NYCers and BRRs, the funds that are actively looking at the divestment question, maybe thinking about these actionable steps that, that we can do. I was at a UN conference yesterday on sustainability and investment, and a lot of sort of the leading edge funds from Europe and other places talked a lot about building climate change into everything they do. So a lot of the Mercer recommendations have to do with investment beliefs and other sort of governance type things that, that BAM would encourage the board to take a look at, while at the same time this more complicated open-end question around decarbonization and divestment takes place.
So concretely, what I've heard both of you say, for one thing, is that we should work on investment beliefs and working on adopting a investment belief statement that I think would become part of the IPS, which is a process. And I know another fund, Suzanne knows this too. We are in the process. We created an investment belief subcommittee that has been working on drafting investment beliefs to then submit to the whole board for discussion and eventual adoption. And I know we have an IPS subcommittee, right? Who's on that? I know Antonio from our office is on that. Who else is on that investment beliefs?
I'm on it, and then TMs.
Robin.
I'm sorry?
And Robin.
Robin, you, and who from the teacher members?
The three of us.
Oh, you're all three on it. Okay, great. So I don't know if that committee, which is, practically a committee as a whole, I mean, my office is represented. Mr. Orlando is not, I guess.
I'm delighted to both be and or not be.
That is the question.
So many times.
So whether we want to incorporate a investment beliefs process into the mandate for the investment beliefs committee, excuse me, for the investment policy statement committee, or whether we want to create a separate process. I don't see the need for that, but
Well,
Dave.
built into the resolution that we just spoke about was this concept of doing an RFI. And so since the resolution kind of talks about not only divestment but a grander climate risk strategy, would it make sense to build into that RFI some work where either we bring somebody in to help us implement the things that are actionable in the Mercer report? So like help us with a belief statement, or help us determine a low carbon index, or things like that. Whatever the steps that we determine we want to move forward, I think it's good to have an outside independent, consultant or entity kind of help us with that. And I think that can kind of be built in to the RFI that goes forward.
I think that's a very good idea, but I would point out a couple of questions about, sort of doing a large RFI. I think that the question around divestment is so sort of central and difficult. The RFI that I think the controller is envisioning wanted to focus on gathering the widest possible input around the divestment question, because basically no one has ever successfully been able to carry out a divestment, in looking at fiduciary issues of a fund our size. So I'm a little bit worried about adding other stuff. Maybe we can talk about parallel tracks or something, but if we're adding sort of governance and other issues to the RFI on divestment, I'm a little concerned that it's going to make the process around divestment less clear. So I would, I think we should just talk about how to best focus.
So it seems to me, hearing what Susanna said, that maybe what we should do is delegate this to the committee, and the committee starts the discussion about investment beliefs. And I think with the permission of the other fund, I think we could share what the other fund has done as an example, which is not to say that that teachers would adopt that policy, verbatim, thank you. I'm not sure how you put that. I don't think that makes it right. And then if the committee recommends that we hire some outside help, that we do that. And frankly, I think that could be done quickly without having to go through a whole RFP. I mean, I think it would be a one-off sort of thing. Valerie, would you agree with that statement? If the committee wanted to hire some outside help to assist with the investment beliefs process, and it could be that Rokaton could assist us in that as well.
Yeah, for example, I think at this other fund, at some point, we're having a facilitated discussion around investment beliefs,
Right.
Which we're all looking forward to.
So we've been
yes.
speaking about it. I think we feel more comfortable with an outside source, not knowing enough about this.
Okay.
I think to kind of guide us and look at all the other possible
Okay.
belief statements to kind of incorporate it. I don't want to, just take up everyone's time willy-nilly putting it together without having someone who really specializes in this.
So honestly, I'm not sure there is anybody who really specializes in it.
Who could at least bring us all of the different,
Right.
different
We actually-
ideas
yeah.
and.
Our office actually assembled this as part of the conference that we organized last year, because remember we talked a lot about investment beliefs at that conference. So we actually have we can provide all the investment, not all, but a whole collection of investment belief statements that other pension funds have adopted that are out there. But then, again, I agree that some kind of at least facilitator who may not necessarily be an expert on investment beliefs, but who can help us guide through the process.
And I think maybe, I don't have the Mercer report in front of me, but there might be things in addition to investment beliefs that we want to, start working on. So, before we decide this is the way we're going on investment beliefs, maybe we should take a comprehensive look at the entire list, and that facilitator person might be able to help us with more than one item.
Yeah.
Well, let me just point out that in support of that point, and something that Dave said in his earlier comments, is that we've already started looking at low carbon index providers.
Mm-hmm.
And so one thing we could do, if we wanted to, is say, let's actually do a search. That was informational, but let's do it. Let's say we want to put X percent, and I actually forget what the final recommendation from Mercer was. Was it 2%?
On the pension side, it was 2.
Sure.
And then, and on the
Yeah,
variable
TDA is
side,
a little trickier.
a little trickier.
Right. So, so I don't know if we. I mean, I think we might want.
I was going to just
Yeah.
state for the record, Rokutana is more than happy to help facilitate a process to help draw out the board's beliefs and views and create a belief statement, as well as facilitate with the work that we've done and even with TRS to this point about reviewing low carbon indices and start thinking through potential implementation considerations for that.
So maybe what we should do, again, I'm just ad-libbing and freelancing here, but maybe what we should do is ask, first of all, I think that on the investment beliefs, we should ask the committee to look at this. Rokutana's already on the committee, so they could help us.
Is this the committee currently charged with reviewing the investment policy?
Yes, but I
just want to make sure that's the same committee. Or
I keep misspeaking.
No, I'm just clarifying.
Yes, thank you for clarifying. But then on the low carbon index, maybe it sounds like what you just described would be coming back to the board with a sort of set of options and perhaps recommendations on implementation for the QPP. Because I mean, maybe we need a separate discussion about TDA. But I think low carbon index with the TDA is, as I think indicated earlier, is a little bit more complicated. Though we could certainly examine it. So maybe want to come back with something on both. And then we as the board review those options and say, okay, this is what we want to do, and then do a search if in fact we want to go forward with selecting a low carbon index provider for some percentage of the assets, at least in QPP, if not the TDA. How does that sound as a...
Well, can I
Yes,
make
of course, Susanna.
question or clarification?
Mm-hmm.
There are other recommendations, I think, in the Mercer report. And I don't know if we want, before we kind of pick those two as things that we want to move forward on directly, and they may be our top two. I just didn't know if we wanted just to kind of go through each one of the recommendations and have, and like try to make a plan. Whether that's having a consultant, come in and sort of facilitate how that plan would work, but I just want to make sure that we're just kind of doing the upfront stuff before we dive into those other things. And that could just be a Mercer Next Step subcommittee having a quick discussion about our order of preference or priority.
Comments?
I have a cheat sheet back at the office that just sort of lays out, I think it's in their executive summary what each one of the points are, but we can kind of go through that.
Just looking for that.
the RFI that the controller's office is preparing will gather information to assist you in preparing an RFP. And you could have the theory an RFI focused on the complicated divestment piece, but an RFP could be broader, cover other areas, and proposers could propose on any combination of services you might want. And just because it's in an RFP doesn't mean you actually have to hire someone to do it. I mean, what you don't want to have to do is multiple RFPs.
Right. You know, the procurement process is something definitely to consider when looking at all of this. And, you know, just so everybody, and I'm glad Sandy Rich is here as well, you know, the idea is to have a scope drafted pretty soon and circulate it to the trustees of the funds that want to move forward on participating in this divestment discussion. So, you know, the scope is going to go to everyone before anything is made public. And, you know, we should all kind of get our heads together on how we think things should proceed.
Will that be with the RFI as well as the RFP?
I was just talking about the RFI.
Do you have how long do you think you'll have the RFI on the streets?
I don't think that long. You know, we haven't, you know, we haven't discussed that, but I would think, you know, a minimum, you know, a time period that is enough that everybody who might be interested could, you know, sort of come in, and then, you know, not open-ended. So I think, you know, some of the ideas were to have, you know, a solicitation of ideas and then some kind of way to review those ideas. And if something seems interesting, maybe have a follow-up with certain, like in an RFP, certain proposers are invited to present to the group. And that would obviously be a group that would take all the funds as well as BAM and, you know, other interested parties.
Is each board allowed to have their own RFP?
What we were thinking is one RFP for the boards that are participated in this. But first the RFI.
Right.
So, as I read the Mercer report, it seems to me that the immediately actionable items are the investment beliefs process, and I think the low carbon index, because we can do the low carbon index without affecting our overall asset allocation. And, you know, you guys heard me in December recommend that we do a review of our asset allocation in the first half of this year, because we're in that 18 to 24 month period since we adopted the asset allocation in June of 2016. And, you know, the markets have changed considerably since then and have not been exactly as anticipated for the first time in history.
Yeah. So strange that would ever happen.
Yes,
And we've been, I think everybody's in agreement on
Right.
that, and that process is going to begin to unfold in the coming months.
Right, and I think that hopefully it will not just begin, but will actually begin and end, because you know, I don't want to take another year and a half to do the next asset allocation the way it took us to do the last one. I know that's a terrible thing that I want, right? But I also thought we could incorporate the discussion of some of the broader Mercer recommendations, like the allocation to sustainability investments on the private sector, which might affect our asset allocation as part of the asset allocation discussion. But because the idea behind the low carbon index, and correct me if I'm wrong, Susan or Michael, is you do it, these products have minimal tracking error, minimize, not let me say minimal, but they seek to minimize tracking error, that we would do it as part of our U.S. equity index allocation, so it wouldn't affect our overall asset allocation, right? Isn't that the idea?
That's correct. It would theoretically fit within what's already been approved by the
Yeah.
board.
So, so I'd like to see us get started on that, even simultaneous with the investment beliefs process and the asset allocation review. That's my thinking. And then the other stuff in the recommendations, I think, is longer term, and part of it at least would be incorporated into the asset allocation review.
What are some of the other things?
So it talked about making allocation to climate-related sustainability things. Example, e.g., this is on page 8 of the Mercer report under the chart. So it says, allocate to climate-related sustainability themes, e.g., renewable energy, energy efficiency, water, waste, agriculture. And
To some extent, we do that already with our infrastructure.
but
allocation.
it's not explicit.
Right, it's not an explicit mandate.
Exactly. So the question is whether we make an explicit mandate to sustainable infrastructure. Remember that this is discussed in, I don't know if it's actually discussed in this version, but it was discussed in earlier versions. I think it is discussed in here as well. Earlier versions earlier drafts that we discussed. Whether we want to make an explicit mandate or allocation within infrastructure and or private equity or real estate, I think, to climate-related investments, climate solutions. I don't know what the broadest term to incorporate that is, but something along those lines. And then I think the question about incorporating climate/ESG analysis into our entire portfolio. When I say our entire portfolio, it's really about the active management because, indexing is indexing. I think is something to discuss as part of our investment beliefs process and then would be incorporated. I think the engagement stuff, we are already very engaged on climate issues with our responsible investment / active shareholder engagement program.
Right.
If you remember, climate is one of the main criteria that we've used for determining which companies to include in our boardroom accountability project.
And we're also very involved on behalf of the funds with the Climate 100 action.
Climate 100 and the task force on climate, what's it called? The task force on climate disclosure, I think it is.
TCDF.
Financial disclosure, yeah.
Okay, so whatever that is. Right.
Yeah, that we're really into
Right,
that.
and there's
One of
another
those.
one. There's another one
Whatever
too.
that
I
is.
think I think the funds are involved in a number of these.
Series, UNPRI.
Of course, we're also part of UNPRI, and
Yeah.
there's a whole
Founding members
alphabet
of
soup
Series.
of organizations that we participate in.
Yeah, and I think it's also, a great opportunity right now to kind of bring all these disparate things that we're doing together, to really kind of announce, what TRS is doing on the issue of climate.
So let me ask this. It seems like the recommendation is for sort of actionable next steps. Number one, investment beliefs, which we are adding to the mandate of the Investment Policy Statement Committee. And number two, along the lines that Michael described earlier, ask Rokaton to come to us with a plan for implementing on the low carbon index idea, and then pursue a search once we've agreed on an implementation plan on that. And then
maybe at that point, since those two are relatively simple, straightforward, let's say, first steps, then maybe, to Susanna's point, then kind of strategize on a plan for some of the other items that are on there that are less readily implementable.
Right, and what I would just add to that, I agree with that, and I would add that I think that some of the investment themes we can review as part of our broader asset allocation process that's going to go on in the coming months, particularly on the sustainability investment side. Now, I think that's all QPP related. And then the question about implementation on the TDA side.
Before we move to
Sorry.
TDA, I'm sorry, can I just ask a question? Just a clarification on the low carbon index. If we're asking Rogaton to kind of come back with a plan, is it that we are agreeing that 2% is the number we'd like Rogaton to kind of look at?
I think we're going to need to coordinate with John and Tatiana. Your team.
So
To me, that's part of the discussion.
Okay, so it's not we've decided on 2% and Rogaton go figure out how to do it.
No.
It's Mercer has this recommendation. Rogaton, bam, what do you think? How could it move forward? Blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah. And that would be the this implementation proposal or whatever that, or options that Rogaton comes back.
And I think, John, you mentioned earlier there's additional considerations for the TDA that we'll need to take into account.
Right. So that was my question, because TDA, I don't know if it's the same document, the same discussion, but to charge TRS and Rogaton with figuring out how do we do this with the TDA, which is more complicated.
Participant-directed assets.
Say it again.
Participant-directed
The
assets.
participant-directed assets, the manager structure is different than it is in QPP.
Yep.
I think this is, this discussion about do we, even in the index side of the U.S. index of the diversified equity fund, how do we feel about, putting participant-directed assets into a low carbon index in that fund?
That's a future discussion.
Say it again?
That's a future discussion.
Future discussion, right.
And I think to that point, I think, bless you.
Thank you.
One of the reasons that I'll pitch for when this whole process is moving through for us to have our own RFP, let's say, is that, because we have the variable funds that we are considering, that's a different set of asks that we might have that wouldn't be in an RFP for some of the other systems. So I think it would make sense down the road, once the RFI is done and when we decide where we want to go. I think it's something that we definitely should consider, is to have, our own consultant, either separate and apart from the other systems, or our own RFP, however it works, because we do have that whole sleeve of variable stuff that we need to think about. And again, I also think, as far as the RFI is concerned, I know the controller really wants that RFI to focus on divestment only. But this is a whole, right? Nothing exists in a vacuum.
Right.
That we're doing here. And so I do believe that it makes sense, at least somewhere in the RFI, for just a piece of it to help to give us information so that we can use it to move forward with some of the Mercer stuff that we want to move on. Not relying on it solely, but something that I think will be able to give us some information so that way we can make some smart decisions.
Okay.
And just to keep in mind that the process here is BAM's going to draft a scope for the RFI, which all the boards, including the TRS board, will have a chance to weigh in on.
Yeah, absolutely. And it should definitely be, a joint process. We want everybody to kind of get what they need from this, because this is uncharted territory.
And how soon will that be? I mean, is that something?
I mean, we're hoping to maybe discuss it at the next SIM, which is not in February. The February SIM is March 2nd, just to confuse everybody.
A month from tomorrow,
yeah.
or 4 weeks from tomorrow.
So hopefully, that's when we'll
Well, February is 28 days, so it's 4 weeks. Anyway, whatever. Yeah.
You can argue math with the actuary?
The actuary says it's
Yeah.
Second, a month from February 2nd.
Me, I argue.
Yeah, that's true. Doesn't matter who.
I was waiting for her to point out that the inflation projection was not up 59%.
The inflation projection was not, I didn't.
It was not up
59%
59%.
return.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
so I think we're satisfied with how this discussion has resolved itself as well. Folks know what the next steps are. Okay. Anything else on the next steps on the motion report? Great. Okay. So I believe that concludes our public agenda for today. So is there a motion to exit public session and enter executive session? Just let's do that motion.
Okay. I move pursuant to Public Officers Law, Section 105, to go into executive session for discussions regarding specific investment matters.
Okay, thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. Any discussion? All in favor of the motion, please say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, please say nay. Any abstentions? Okay, motion carries. Back in public session. Susan, would you please report out of executive session?
Certainly, in executive session, we received a presentation from a convertibles manager. Consensus was reached, which will be announced at the appropriate time.
Great, thank you very much. I think that concludes our business for today. Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion? All in favor of the motion to adjourn, please say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, please say nay. Any abstentions? Motion carries. Meeting is adjourned.